London, 1891. The city's fog was not just weather, it was a veil, thick with secrets no man dared to breathe too deeply. Hidden beneath the gaslight glow and the polite manners of Victorian society was a truth so disturbing, most men would have fled if they had only heard it whispered. But you must not flee. You came here for the forbidden. You came here for the kind of story that rips open the illusions you thought were real. In that year, police reports spoke of a boy who did not speak to his teachers, nor his mother, nor even to God in prayer. He spoke only to the dead. Not in metaphor, not in madness, but in chilling detail, answering questions no living child should have known. His words spilled from pale lips in morgues, graveyards, and dimly lit basements where the air itself seemed to rot. The newspapers buried it. The church silenced it. The Crown pretended it never happened. Because, if it were true, it meant that death itself had been breached, and not by some priest or philosopher, but by a child no older than 11. You feel that unease in your chest, don't you? That pull between disbelief and dread? Hold it, because this is not just a tale of one strange boy. This is about what was hidden from you, what London buried under soot and silence, and why men in black coats carrying documents stamped with the insignia of secret orders suddenly appeared at the boy's doorstep. The boy's name is never recorded in official registers, wiped, erased, as though he never drew breath. Yet fragments of testimony survive, coroners, midwives, undertakers, all claiming the same thing. The corpses answered him back. And that is where we begin. Imagine the sound, a morgue in Whitechapel, gas lamps flickering, the scent of lime and decay, an 11-year-old boy standing before a slab of frozen flesh, eyes unblinking, voice calm as he asks questions. And the dead, lips move, not wide, not screaming, just enough to speak, as if the grave itself bent its law to grant him audience. What would you do if you saw it? Dismiss it as madness, or admit the truth that history has always hidden its darkest miracles, and you were never meant to hear of them? Tonight you will. You must understand, Victorian London was already a city of shadows. Beneath the grandeur of its palaces and theatres, corpses piled high in paupers' graves, infants buried in shallow earth, and the Thames itself carried the stench of rot. Death was everywhere, yet this boy, he seemed chosen by death itself. Witnesses said he never played, never laughed, never cried like other children. His eyes, grey, unyielding, studied the world as though it were an experiment already failed. And when he finally spoke, it was not to the living. His first words were recorded in horror by his mother. She claimed she found him in their candle-lit parlour, kneeling beside his dead grandfather's body. The child's lips moved, and the corpse's eyelids twitched. Then, in a brittle voice, the grandfather spoke back, murmuring his final regrets. Do you see the fracture here? This was not just superstition. These were respected midwives, undertakers, coroners, men and women whose entire lives were spent among the dead, swearing under oath that the impossible had occurred. And yet every account vanished into silence. Witnesses changed their testimonies. Names disappeared from ledgers. Families left London overnight as if they'd been warned or threatened. Why? Because the boy's ability was not seen as a miracle. It was seen as a weapon. In 1891, London was a hive of secret societies. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, all clawing at the veil, desperate to pierce it. To control a child who could extract confessions from corpses. Imagine the power. No crime unsolved, no secret safe, no soul beyond interrogation. And the Crown knew it. Reports surfaced, never published, but whispered in occult circles that men in black coats arrived at the boy's home days later. They removed him quietly, telling neighbors he had fallen ill. No funeral followed, no grave was marked. And yet, sightings of him continued, always in places where the dead were gathered. Morgues, mass graves. Even in an asylum where he was said to wander the halls at night, speaking to the cadavers waiting for dissection. London wanted this story to vanish, but fragments survived, letters hidden in church archives, sealed testimonies from undertakers too afraid to lie. And all of them agree, the boy could speak to corpses. And the corpses spoke back. And you must ask yourself now, if the dead can speak, then whose voice controls the living? You were taught that history is clean, that records and dates are the truth. But history is not truth. It is curation. It is selection. It is a knife cutting away what must never be seen. And this boy, this nameless corpse whisperer of London, was carved out of the record with surgical precision. That alone should tell you how dangerous he was. What was his true function? Think carefully. If the dead could speak through him, then every crime buried, every conspiracy silenced, every oath sealed by the grave could be exposed. Imagine how unstable that would make the powerful. Kings, bankers, priests, men who build empires on secrets. What happens when secrets no longer stay buried? Do you see the threat? This boy wasn't just strange. He was a breach in the architecture of control. Because power is not built on wealth alone, it is built on silence. The silence of victims, the silence of history, the silence of the grave, and he shattered it. Records suggest he was taken to a hidden institution outside London. Not an orphanage, not an asylum, something else. A facility known only in whispers as Blackfriars House. It was said to be funded jointly by private bankers and church officials, a place where children with unusual gifts were studied, broken, reshaped into tools. There are letters, faded, unsigned, that describe experiments. A boy seated in a candlelit room surrounded by coffins, priests chanting, doctors recording, officials watching. The corpses, once touched by the boy's voice, began to murmur answers to questions, names, dates, confessions of sins long hidden. Understand what that means. If true, this was not communication with spirits. This was not seance trickery. It was the corpse itself, the biological husk, the silent witness of violence, forced to give up its memory. Science could not explain it. Religion feared it. But the men of power hungered for it. Beck, as if you can make the dead talk, then no deed ever truly disappears. And that is why the boy had to vanish. He had become the most dangerous child in London, not because he was cursed, but because he was useful. Useful to those who would control truth itself. Now ask yourself, what kind of system buries a child so completely that even his name dissolves? And more importantly, what else have they buried from you? Victorian London was not only a city of science and progress, it was a city of occult obsession. Behind closed doors, in candlelit chambers scented with incense and secrecy, the elite summoned forces they pretended not to believe in. Men of parliament, bankers, even physicians, they gathered in private lodges where symbols older than Christianity were carved into the wood. Their goal was always the same: power through forbidden knowledge. And into this feverish hunt for control came the boy, a living key to the one frontier that had always eluded them, death itself. Think of it, the Rosicrucians, already whispering of alchemical resurrection, the Freemasons, obsessed with ancient rites of silence and burial, the Hermetic Brotherhood, weaving together Egyptian mysticism and modern science. To them, this boy was not a tragedy, he was treasure. He was the door they had been battering against for centuries, flung open. There are accounts, buried in the archives of private collections, of seances held where the boy was placed at the center. Not a medium, not a channeler. He didn't call spirits. He didn't close his eyes and sway in trance. He simply spoke, calm, direct, as though conversing with the living. And the corpses responded. Their mouths twitched, their throats gurgled, words escaped as if dragged unwilling from decayed lungs. Some claimed it was memory stored in muscle, others believed it was something darker, that the boy wasn't speaking to the dead at all, but speaking through them, using their husks as vessels for something else, something that had always been watching, waiting for an instrument to speak through. And the elite, they didn't recoil, they leaned closer. They asked the corpses for names of rivals, for confessions of debt, for secrets hidden in graves that, if revealed, could shift entire empires. The boy became less of a child and more of a device, a tool for the hungry. But here is the truth you must not ignore. When the powerful embrace the unnatural, it is never for understanding. It is for domination. The boy was never protected, never nurtured, he was consumed. And when they had pulled from him all they could, he was erased. His name struck out, his body never accounted for. History teaches you that progress came from invention, from reason, from order. But the deeper truth, progress came from shadows, from experiments the world was never meant to see, and this boy, this forgotten, erased child, was one of those experiments. Now tell me, do you really believe history ever told you the whole story? You may think this was only occult fascination, a grotesque curiosity confined to secret chambers, but you would be wrong. The boy's case was not just about death, it was about control. And control, in Victorian London, was the true currency of empire. The late 1800s were an age when institutions tightened their grip on the mind. Schools drilled obedience, churches demanded submission, factories crushed individuality beneath the weight of routine, and beneath all of it, unseen, governments and secret orders sought ways to refine obedience into something scientific, predictable, measurable, total. That boy was not the first anomaly they studied, but he was the most dangerous, because his ability revealed something institutions could not afford to admit. That truth exists beyond their control. A corpse has no allegiance, no ideology, no propaganda. If the dead could speak, they would bypass all systems of censorship. They would tell what they saw, unfiltered, unshaped, raw. Imagine what that would do to the narratives of kings and clerics. And so, he was taken. Not to be silenced, but to be studied. To see whether his curse, or gift, could be replicated. Letters describe attempts to force other children into proximity with the dead, trying to awaken the same ability. Most failed, many died, but it did not matter. For the men running these trials were not searching for miracles, they were searching for systems. If they could isolate the conditions, control the process, break down the forbidden into steps, then what was once a curse could be turned into protocol. And protocols can be taught, repeated, institutionalized. That is how power works, not through wonder, but through system. The boy became their specimen, his every word catalogued, his every reaction recorded, his silence punished, his speech exploited. What had once been a human child was reduced to data. Do you see now the pattern? The story of the boy is not only about one child lost in history, it is about the blueprint of institutional control, the attempt to capture mystery, strip it of its humanity and weaponize it against the very masses it should have awakened. And that blueprint never vanished. It evolved. It survived. It still exists in the institutions around you today. The only difference is, now you are the specimen. Do not mistake this for a ghost story. This is not about apparitions or the supernatural lingering in graveyards. No, this is about control, about how those who rule learned to weaponize fear, silence, and obedience, and the boy was their test subject. The late Victorian era birthed more than industrial might. It birthed psychology as a tool of power. The same London that locked away this child also hosted the rise of men who claimed the human mind could be dissected, measured, rewired. They were not healers, they were engineers of obedience. Why do you think the boy disappeared into an institution no one dared name? Because he was the perfect specimen to break down the boundary between the seen and the unseen. He showed them that the human mind could be bent toward unnatural channels, forced to perceive what others could not. If one child could be conditioned to draw language from the dead, then perhaps other children could be conditioned to speak only what authority demanded. Think about it. If you could train a population to hear what you wanted them to hear and forget what you needed them to forget, wouldn't that be more powerful than armies? Wouldn't it be the perfect empire? The boy's gift, twisted into experiment, became the seed of psychological warfare. It was never about corpses, it was about memory, about the ability to control what is remembered, and more importantly, what is erased. His very existence became proof that human beings could be made into conduits of something greater than themselves, if they were broken properly. And so the boy was broken. Testimony says he began to lose his own voice. He stopped speaking to his captors, stopped speaking even to the dead. They had drained him, forced him into silence. But silence was never his own. It was engineered. It was the silence of a child turned into a weapon, then discarded. And here lies the bitter truth. When they erased him from history, they were not just silencing a boy. They were perfecting the craft of silencing you, of ensuring that when forbidden knowledge rises, it is buried, smothered, stamped out before it can ignite rebellion. The boy's case was not an anomaly, it was a prototype, and you live inside the perfected version of that system today. History is a pattern maker, and patterns are the language of control. What happened to the boy did not begin with him, it followed a template older than empires. Notice the repeating shapes. First, a rupture appears. Someone sees what others must not. Then the institution intervenes, claiming benevolence while wielding eradication. Next, testimonies are fractured. Witnesses move away. Documents are redacted. Finally, the event is folded into silence and the public record is declared whole again. This is nonsense to the comfortable but a map to the observant. The boy's erasure fits that shape perfectly. His name removed, his records hollowed out, the witnesses coerced into forgetfulness. But the pattern reaches beyond one child. Look harder, and you will find it in the dismantled uprisings, the rewritten scientific debates, the lost revelations of whistleblowers who suddenly vanish. Every time a truth threatens the ruling narrative, that familiar architecture activates. It is the blueprint of suppression. Why study patterns? Because patterns are predictable, and predictable systems can be resisted. If you can recognize the sequence, you can anticipate the move. You can see where they will cut the light and where they will try to rethread the story. The boy's story teaches you this. Erasure is never random. It is deliberate, it is surgical, it is designed to return the world to its preferred ignorance. This erasure is also symbolic. When a child who spoke to corpses is expunged, the message sent is twofold. First, that the order's boundary is inviolable. Second, that any breach will be met not with debate, but with obliteration. Erasing a person sends a warning far louder than a public argument. It teaches fear at a cultural scale. It trains communities to self-censor and to police each other's curiosity. And so, suppression becomes cultural conditioning. Generations learn to avoid certain questions, to mistrust uncomfortable witnesses, to prefer the safety of sanctioned history. That is how power multiplies, by turning silence into habit. The boy's disappearance was not only a removal of a witness, it was a lesson in collective amnesia. Now listen, man, learning tactics. When you see names removed from ledgers, when you find footnotes that end abruptly, when families are forced into sudden exile, recognize the pattern. It is the same machinery at work, refined and relentless. You are watching the contours of control as they have always operated, and if you learn them, you begin to unmask them and resist with precision. The deeper you travel into this story, the more you will feel it tugging at something inside you, a recognition you can't quite name. That's because the boy's erasure was not only historical, it was psychological. You were meant to inherit his silence without even knowing he existed. That is how the system works. It buries not only events but instincts. It teaches you to recoil from the forbidden before you even understand why. The Victorians called it moral hygiene. Today you might call it social order. But the function is the same. Shape the mind so it turns away from dangerous questions. Train men to fear ridicule more than lies. Condition them to laugh at what threatens the narrative. That is not a coincidence. That is design. The boy was the perfect test. Imagine what it meant for a child to shatter the sacred boundary between life and death. If London admitted it, society itself would fracture. Priests would lose authority. Politicians would lose secrets, scientists would lose credibility, and the people, those who labored, suffered, and buried their dead, would realize they had been deceived. So they buried him instead, not just his body, but the possibility he represented, the possibility that truth does not belong to institutions, the possibility that a child from the gutter might hold more power than a parliament of lords. That possibility is the most dangerous idea of all. But here's the part they could never fully erase. Traces survive. The whispers of undertakers, the half-burned letters in church archives, the fragments passed from one secret society to another, and now through me to you. This is what terrifies them most, not that the boy existed, but that the story of his existence might awaken you. Because once you hear it, you cannot return to sleep. You begin to see the fractures in every narrative, the edges where the knife of censorship has seized, but too clean. You begin to notice what is missing, and you realize that absence is not natural, it is engineered. This is why I speak to you with weight and severity, not to entertain, but to rewire, to cut away the conditioning, to remind you of the pattern, because the moment you recognize the silence is designed, you are no longer its prisoner. The boy's voice was stolen, but your awareness is not, unless you surrender it willingly. Listen closely. The boy's silence did not die with him. It evolved into method. By the 1890s, Britain was quietly assembling the machinery that would later project influence across continents, networks of informants, whisperers, men trained to extract truth and subdue dissent. The lines between charity, church, and crown blurred. Beneath respectable veneers, an intelligence apparatus formed, less about espionage abroad, and more about control at home. The boy's case fed that apparatus. Consider the logic. If a child could be used to unearth buried facts, then what could disciplined networks of humans, trained in interrogation, surveillance, and narrative control, accomplish? What began as occult curiosity became a prototype for technique. Methods once applied to a single anomalous child were systematized. Observation protocols, interrogation scripts, methods for recruiting fearful witnesses, and processes for laundering inconvenient testimonies into silence. Those who ran Blackfriars House did not throw away their notes. They archived them, analyzed them, and passed them to men in suits who knew how to scale an experiment into policy. This is where the institutional mask slips. The same committees that fund hospitals and publish journals also fund programs designed to map the human mind, cataloging fears, predicting reaction, engineering forgetfulness. The boy's speech patterns, the moments when a corpse would twitch and yield a phrase, these became data points. How to replicate the appearance of authority, how to manufacture confession, how to ensure that the masses accepted a single immutable story. And once a technique is repeatable, it becomes bureaucratic. Departments form, budgets are allocated, quiet correspondences move through trusted channels, names in ledgers become programs in budgets, the occult ritual turns into an operational manual. The boy shifted from a miracle to metric, and through that transformation, his existence birthed systems that could manipulate memory at scale. You must not misunderstand, this was not supernatural omnipotence. It was social engineering refined by people who understood institutions better than most. They learned which levers to pull: shame, economic pressure, legal ambiguity, to make communities police themselves. They learned to weaponize grief, to turn mourning into compliance. The dead's testimony, once a threat, was domesticated into a tool for social control. So when you hear the phrase, "the boy who spoke to corpses," remember this. The scandal did not end in a quiet house outside London. It migrated into ministries, into hospitals, into charitable trusts. It became a model for how power could be internalized by a people until they began to forget even their own suspicions. And that, more than any seance, is the true horror, the slow institutionalization of erasure, done with paperwork, with polite signatures, and with the moral certainty of men who believed they were saving civilization by stealing its memory. By now you must feel it, the realization that this story has little to do with a single child and everything to do with the architecture of control. The boy was not erased because he frightened people. He was erased because he revealed something the ruling classes could not allow the masses to see, that truth is not fixed, that memory is malleable, and that authority depends on owning both. In Victorian London, the state and the church understood a dangerous principle. If the dead could speak, no secret was safe, and if no secret was safe, no hierarchy could endure. That is why the boy was not a scandal to them. He was a threat to the entire order. To rulers, order is sacred, not morality, not honesty. Order. And so the child's gift was harvested, institutionalized, then destroyed, leaving nothing but whispers. Do you see the deeper lesson? Power does not fear the supernatural. It fears exposure. It fears the uncontrollable narrative that does not flow through its channels. That is why the boy was hidden, and that is why you today are flooded not with silence but with endless noise, distraction, entertainment, infinite streams of trivia, so that you never notice what has been cut out, what has been deliberately buried. The boy's case was one piece of a larger machinery, the evolution of psychological control into culture. Erasure refined into distraction, fear refined into ridicule, control refined into consent. What was tested on one child in Blackfriars House is now tested on millions of men daily, through the systems you think are neutral, but are anything but. Ask yourself, when was the last time you were told something so disturbing, so inconvenient, that you felt the weight of suppression? It is rare. Not because there are no suppressed truths, but because suppression has become seamless. The cut is so clean you don't even see the wound. And when you do stumble upon something jagged, something forbidden, you are told it is madness, conspiracy, delusion, exactly as they said about the boy. And yet, you are here, hearing his story, a story they failed to erase completely. That should tell you something. Control is powerful, but never absolute. There are always leaks in the dam, cracks in the wall, always remnants left behind for those willing to look. That is where you stand now, in the crack, staring at what was buried. The question is, will you look away, or will you descend deeper? The investigation took on a disturbing new turn when the coroner presented his findings. The children's bodies bore no signs of natural death. Instead, their bones showed stress fractures, their joints displayed unnatural stiffness, and the ligaments appeared torn, as though forced into grotesque positions before or after death. One child's skull had been sawn open with meticulous precision, not in the rough manner of an amateur, but with the calculated care of someone practiced in anatomical dissection. These details horrified even the hardened townsfolk, yet they also confirmed a terrible suspicion. The children were not just killed, they were studied. Theories spread like wildfire. Some whispered that the brothers were supplying body parts to secret societies, wealthy collectors, or foreign scientists who paid handsomely for specimens no one dared to ask about. Others claimed the brothers had crossed into necromancy, seeking forbidden knowledge by experimenting on the innocent. The sheriff's men raided the abandoned farmhouse, searching for evidence that could tie the brothers to these atrocities. What they discovered beneath the rotting floorboards sent one deputy fleeing into the night. Jars filled with preserved organs, delicate bones displayed like trophies, and a series of notebooks written in a strange clinical hand. The pages catalogued each body in chilling detail: age, weight, cause of death, and even notes on resilience of tissue and decay under varying conditions. The community, already sick with grief, now faced the unbearable realization that the brothers had reduced children to mere experiments. Rage erupted at the funeral gatherings. Fathers demanded blood. Mothers wept until their voices broke. The name of the Carter brothers was no longer spoken with fear, but with a venomous hatred that promised retribution. And yet, amid the growing uproar, one unsettling truth remained: the brothers themselves were nowhere to be found. Some swore they had seen two shadowy figures boarding a train under the cover of night, their suitcases rattling with something more than clothes. Others insisted the brothers had gone underground, hiding in plain sight among the very people they had betrayed. By the end of that week, New Orleans no longer felt like a city of jazz and trade. It had become a hunting ground, one where the hunters and the hunted shared the same haunted streets. Fear, once whispered in taverns and at kitchen tables, now poured into the streets. By early spring of 1892, New Orleans was gripped by something darker than panic. It was hysteria. Posters with crude sketches of the Carter brothers' faces appeared on lampposts and shop doors, offering rewards for information. Yet even those who swore they had seen the brothers kept silent, terrified of what revenge might come if their prey was not caught. Church bells tolled not just for worship but as warnings, signaling fresh discoveries of graves torn open at the city's edge. Families began sleeping with rifles propped against their beds, Coffins were chained shut before burial, some even weighted with iron, for fear that the brothers, or something worse, would disturb the dead yet again. The newspapers, ever hungry for scandal, fanned the flames. Headlines screamed of the child collectors and the science of horror. Each day, new rumors surfaced, claims that the brothers had been seen performing rituals in the swamps, or that they had struck bargains with voodoo practitioners for protection. It mattered little whether these stories were true. In a city already steeped in superstition, they carried the weight of gospel. It was then that whispers of a curse began to spread. A midwife claimed that the brothers had invoked spirits older than Christ, spirits that could not be undone by law or rope. A preacher thundered from his pulpit that their crimes were not merely against man, but against God himself, and that divine punishment would fall not only on the brothers, but on anyone who harbored them. Mob justice began to simmer. Groups of men, torches in hand, patrolled the night streets, searching cellars and barns. Some dragged strangers from their homes on nothing more than suspicion. Innocent travelers were beaten, their accents or unfamiliar clothes mistaken for proof of conspiracy. The line between justice and madness blurred until the city felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And through it all, one haunting fact remained. The brothers had vanished, yet the graves kept opening and bodies kept disappearing. It was no longer certain whether the city was hunting men or something that men had unleashed. By midsummer, the hunt had spilt far beyond the streets of New Orleans. The Carter brothers' names became curses whispered in parishes across Louisiana. Then rumors carried up the river by merchants, traders, and fugitives. Lawmen in Baton Rouge, Natchez, and even Memphis received reports of two gaunt men moving by night, feeding on fear as much as flesh. Yet every sighting contradicted the last. Some claimed the brothers looked young and strong. Others said they were skeletal, barely shadows of men. Deputies rode out with dogs, tracking reports of barns broken into, of animals drained and left in silence. But the trails always dissolved into the swamps, where the cypress roots twisted like bones and the water swallowed all evidence. The Carters seemed untouchable, as though the marsh itself was hiding them. Behind closed doors, investigators began to whisper a different possibility, that the brothers had not fled at all, that perhaps they had never intended to. Evidence surfaced that the family home, boarded, abandoned, and left to rot, still carried signs of recent use. Candles burned down to their stubs, scraps of meat left fresh upon the table. Someone had been there, someone who always returned. More disturbing still were the symbols carved into the wood, hidden beneath rugs and along beams, twisted shapes, half Christian and half pagan, the kind not found in any Bible but in fragments of occult texts, long outlawed. One investigator swore he saw the sigil of Moloch, the devourer of children, etched deep into the floorboards. Another recognized markings tied to European blood cults whispered about during the famine years. What frightened them most was not the symbols themselves, but what they implied, that the brothers' appetite was not born of madness alone, but of method, ritual, design. It began to seem as though the Carter brothers were not acting in isolate, but rather serving something older, an inheritance passed through centuries, wearing new masks in each age. And if that was true, then the city was not hunting men at all, it was chasing phantoms across history. What the authorities uncovered in the Carter home was too volatile to publish in the papers. They feared panic would erupt into civil collapse if the public knew the depth of the symbols carved into the floorboards. And so, the official line remained. Two madmen, murderers, still at large. But behind closed doors, in the smoke-filled back rooms of police precincts and church basements, a different story was whispered. Those sigils were not random. They were not scrolls of lunatics. They aligned with patterns seen across centuries of blood cults. The same signs left behind in plague-era Europe, in the hills of Transylvania, and in the burnt remains of villages that vanished without explanation. Always paired with ritual sacrifice, always tied to the harvesting of blood. One Jesuit priest summoned to inspect the markings trembled as he ran his fingers across the carvings. He said the design resembled an old rite forbidden by the Vatican itself, a rite of preservation, blood taken not for pleasure, not for sustenance, but to extend the flesh, to halt the march of time itself. The idea was grotesque, yet chillingly simple. Consume the lifeblood of the young, and the rot of age slows. Consume enough, and one does not merely preserve the body, but alter it, make it less human, more vessel. If this was what the Carter brothers practiced, then they were not acting as desperate criminals. They were following a manual, a scripture of shadows handed down from those who had feasted before them. Think of what that means. These men, gaunt, feared, hunted, were not anomalies. They were inheritors, carriers of a tradition too dark for history books. And like all traditions, it needed participants, apprentices, witnesses. So the question emerged, who taught them? The Carter brothers had no history of literacy, no access to European texts, yet the markings they left were precise, intentional. Someone had shown them, someone had guided their hand. And if that someone still walked the streets of New Orleans, or worse, the halls of its churches, its courts, its elite circles, then perhaps the Carter brothers were never fugitives at all. Perhaps they were servants. The search for the Carter brothers was no longer a chase through alleys and swamps. It became a hunt through parlors, drawing rooms, and candlelit halls where the city's elite gathered behind locked doors. For as whispers spread of ritual symbols and preservation rites, eyes began to turn toward those who profited most from secrecy. It began with a single rumor, that the Carters had once worked as errand boys for a shipping magnate whose business never seemed to fail, no matter the storms or fires that crippled his rivals. From there, suspicion spread like disease. Names of judges, politicians, and merchants began circulating, not for crimes of finance, but for hosting suppers where the wine ran dark, and no one dared to ask what simmered in the kettles. Servants told tales of cellars sealed with iron doors, of muffled cries beneath the floorboards during gatherings that stretched until dawn. One chambermaid swore she saw children brought in through the back entrance, never to leave again. She fled the city the next morning, convinced she had glimpsed something that no faith could wash from her memory. The press, eager for scandal, avoided these accusations. They would not bite the hand that fed them, but the common man spoke freely. Street preachers declared that the brothers were nothing more than tools, hounds let loose by masters who sat in luxury, sipping brandy while the city burned in fear. And yet the more the people accused, the more untouchable these elites became. They wrapped themselves in law, in wealth, in sanctity. They pointed fingers back at the poor, blaming immigrants, blaming foreign superstitions, blaming anyone too weak to resist. But those who studied the Carter house, the sigils, the patterns, the rites, saw the threads too clearly to ignore. The brothers were not anomalies, they were instruments, and instruments need composers. The question that haunted investigators was no longer what the Carters had done, but why? Why them? Why here? And why now, in a city still bleeding from war, still fractured by poverty and superstition? The answer, some dared to suggest, was terrifyingly simple, because New Orleans was fertile ground. A place where corruption walked openly in daylight, and the hunger for immortality found willing buyers in the highest places. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. The Carter brothers should have been caught long before their names ever made the papers. Arrest warrants were delayed, evidence disappeared, and witnesses who dared to testify against them either fled or vanished. The machinery of justice did not move slowly, it moved selectively, and that selectivity pointed to protection. One deputy confessed years later that he had been ordered to stand down when given a chance to raid a farmhouse where the brothers had been sighted. His superior told him, "Some men are not meant to be touched, not by you, not by me." That farmhouse burned the next night, its walls still dripping with what neighbors swore was blood. Court records from the period show strange gaps, transcripts missing, pages blacked out. Even the official death toll was suspiciously low, though parish priests recorded far more burials than usual in their ledgers. Someone, somewhere, had decided the public could not be trusted with the real numbers. And then there was the trial that never happened. For all the hysteria, for all the torches in the street, the Carter brothers were never formally placed before a jury. Instead, their fate unfolded in the shadows. Some claimed they were captured and quietly executed, their bodies disposed of in secret. Others believed they were allowed to flee, their passage paid by hands eager to see them gone. But the most unsettling account came from a single guard at Orleans Parish Prison. He claimed the brothers were indeed taken into custody, but not held in cells. They were escorted into a private wing, where doctors and priests visited at odd hours. He swore the brothers were not treated as criminals, but as specimens. Specimens of what, he never dared to ask. The official story insists the Carter brothers were hanged, but no grave has ever been confirmed. No photograph. No public execution. No proof. Just a declaration stamped by men who had every reason to close the book. And so the legend grew, that the brothers did not die at all, that they were absorbed into the very system meant to punish them, that instead of ending their reign of terror, the city merely changed its form, moving from the swamps into the drawing rooms, where rituals could be cloaked in respectability. For what is more dangerous, two killers in the night, or the institutions that choose to protect them? The Carter brothers were never meant to be remembered. That is the most telling clue of all. History, when it is clean, leaves trails, trials, obituaries, death certificates. But when history is dirty, when it threatens the foundation of power itself, it is not written in ink. It is erased, and yet erasure leaves shadows. Researchers who stumbled across fragments of the case found uncanny parallels far from New Orleans. In Romania, whispers of blood cults tied to noble families stretched back centuries. In Bavaria, sealed Jesuit letters described boys drained dry, their deaths masked as plague. Even in London's archives, a handful of restricted documents referenced the preservation rights, identical in description to the sigils carved into the Carters' floorboards. The most disturbing connection, however, was across the ocean, in the Caribbean. Haitian accounts spoke of European men arriving during the 18th century, men who demanded blood not for superstition, but for endurance. These men integrated into trade routes, hiding within merchant circles, passing their practices like a secret inheritance. New Orleans, sitting as it did at the crossroads of trade, was the perfect port for such knowledge to resurface. The Carter brothers were not innovators, they were vessels, pawns chosen because they were disposable, and when their usefulness expired, the same forces that elevated them ensured their silence. Think carefully about this. The brothers' names have been reduced to folklore, their crimes recast as mere superstition, yet the sigils match, the rituals match, the cover-ups match. Across continents, across centuries, the pattern remains. And what is a pattern if not proof of design? Men with money, men with power, have always feared one truth above all others, that their time will end, that their flesh will rot, that the grave will take them. To escape this inevitability, they will bargain with gods or devils alike, and when blood is the price, it is never their blood. The Carter brothers are remembered as monsters, but the deeper terror is this: they were only servants. Their masters, those who still dine in chandeliers and marble halls, remain untouched, unspoken, unseen. That is why this story was buried, not to protect the public from fear, but to protect the powerful from exposure. You must understand, this is not simply history. It is not a quaint tale of two madmen in the swamps of Louisiana. No, what happened in 1891 was a rupture, a glimpse into machinery that has always been here, hidden just beyond the veil. Think of it. When the Carters were erased, did the hunger vanish? Did the rituals end? Or were they simply absorbed into safer hands, hands draped in silk gloves and gold rings, hands that could practice behind cathedral walls and private estates, beyond the reach of common men? The truth is this: patterns that stretch across continents, across centuries, do not vanish. They adapt. They disguise themselves. What once looked like cult symbols in rotting floorboards now takes the form of sealed archives, charitable foundations, even medical experiments dressed in the language of progress. The hunger remains. It always does. Do you see the brilliance of the system? The Carter brothers, ragged, violent, obvious, were useful only as lightning rods. They carried the darkness in a form so grotesque that the public could point, scream, and condemn. Meanwhile, the true practitioners, the orchestrators, faded deeper into the shadows, untouchable. And ask yourself, What is more terrifying, a pair of killers in the night, or an institution that feeds on the same hunger but cloaks itself in legitimacy? The graves still open, the bodies still vanish. They are just spoken of differently now. Instead of monsters, the public is told of medical anomalies, unexplained disappearances, statistical noise. Instead of torch-bearing mobs, the people now sign consent forms, hand over their children, donate their blood. The game did not end in 1891, it evolved. And if you think this is simply a story of the past, ask yourself why the same patterns appear again and again. Ask why every century produces its Carters, expendable faces to absorb the outrage. Why will the real architects remain faceless, nameless, eternal? This is the truth they bury. The Carter brothers were never the story. They were the mask. The story is the system, and that system has never gone away. Look closely and you will see the masks still worn today. They do not call themselves cults anymore. They call themselves boards, commissions, trusts. They meet not in swamps, but in glass towers. And yet the essence has not changed. Think of the rituals you accept as normal. Needles in arms, fluids drawn, catalogued, stored. Hospitals that speak of health while harvesting the very essence of life. Do you truly believe all of it is for charity, for healing? Or is it the same hunger, dressed in a white coat instead of a blood-stained apron? Think of the way the powerful age. Do they age like you? Do they wither, wrinkle, and falter in the same way? Or do they preserve themselves year after year, as though time obeyed different rules for them? Ask yourself what is fueling that preservation. Ask who paid the price. This is the pattern. Elites feed on fear, on flesh, on futures that are not their own. And every century, when someone stumbles too close to the truth, a Carter is unleashed. An expendable villain. A grotesque distraction. Something the public can chase while the real machinery hums in silence. The Carter brothers were obvious, too obvious. They were meant to be caught, meant to be condemned, meant to terrify you into missing the deeper truth. That the real ritual was never in the swamps. It was in the courts, the churches, the hidden chambers of power. Now I ask you, how much of your own life has been guided by hands you cannot see? How much of your blood, your labor, your children's futures have already been fed into a machine older than any government? This is where the descent becomes dangerous, because once you recognize the pattern, once you admit it to yourself, there is no turning back. The Carter brothers are not history, they are prophecy, and their story is not over. Now you stand at the edge of decision. This is where knowledge stops being comfortable and becomes accountability. I will not soften this for you. Look at your life, the stories you accept without question, the institutions you defer to because they wear suits and speak politely. These are the places the machinery hides. Start small. Check the charity that asks for names but never shows accounts. Notice which narratives are repeated until they feel inevitable. Observe who benefits whenever a scandal is diverted. That's how the system survives, by making you look away while it feeds. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. The same techniques used to erase the boy and domesticate the Carter horror have been refined into social habits. Distraction, ridicule, bureaucratic opacity. They teach compliance as virtue, obedience as wisdom. They condition men to accept the official line because the alternative is chaos, except it isn't chaos, it's clarity. The alternative is the dangerous act of remembering. You want a practical tether? Begin with attention. Where does your attention go when a story becomes dangerous? Who profits when questions die? Ask yourself who is asking you to forget and why. Men in power never ask for your attention without returning something in control. They exchange narratives for obedience. Your refusal to trade scrutiny for comfort is the first step in dismantling the machine. Now a ritual of your own, not a cult, but intentional. Rituals train the mind, they break habituated silence. In the middle of this descent, I ask you to do something small and definitive. Write a symbolic phrase in the comments below, twice, back to back. Don't think of likes or views, think of identity. Repeat. I unbury truth. I unbury truth. Type it, exactly as you see it, twice. This is not superstition, it is a psychological marker. By writing the phrase twice, You to create a small fracture in your own conditioning, a deliberate break with passive acceptance. Comment it once for recognition, comment it again to lock in the decision. When you do this, you signal to yourself and to the algorithm that you are awake. You make a minor public commitment to curiosity over comfort. You force the platform to register you not as a passive consumer, but as a participant. It helps the story spread to other curious men who will not turn away. More importantly, it trains you to speak when others want you silent. So type it now, with intention. I unbury truth. I unbury truth. Do that and the descent deepens, but it also begins to become choice rather than fate. Do you feel it now? That shift in your chest, like a door opening into a room you didn't know was there. That is what happens when you speak truth into a space designed for silence. Small act, yes, but the smallest acts are often the most dangerous. And now you've crossed a threshold. The Carter brothers were erased because they represented a door too many people began to look through. Their story was not just about blood and graves, it was about exposure of a system that thrives on silence, that feeds on obedience, that fattens itself on those too distracted to notice. But here's the darker truth. The erasure was not failure, it was success, because it taught the machine how to cover its tracks more efficiently. What was once crude and grotesque became polished and professional. The rituals did not stop. They simply changed uniforms. Think of how easily men are pacified now. Bread and circuses, they called it in Rome. Today it's screens and slogans. Fear has been weaponized not through corpses in alleyways, but through invisible numbers, endless headlines, and the constant hum of crisis. You are being fed horror, not to awaken you, but to exhaust you, so that when the real horror stands before you, you no longer react. And always behind the curtain, the same hunger persists. Preservation, control. The attempt to outpace death by consuming the lives of others, whether literally in blood or figuratively in labor, in attention, in time stolen from you and fed to someone else's immortality project. The Carter brothers were pawns in a crude ritual. You are pawns in a refined one. The question is whether you remain asleep on the board or flip it over. Do not think of this as entertainment. This is initiation. Every layer of this descent is designed to strip away the excuses that keep men soft. The Carter brothers' tale is a parable, but not a closed one. It is a mirror. And what it reflects is not the horror of the past. It is the machinery of now. You commented the phrase. You marked yourself. Now, whether you realize it or not, you are inside the labyrinth. And once you enter, the only way out is through. Look carefully at the architecture of power today, and you'll see the same fingerprints that stained the Carter brothers' floorboards. Different costumes, same symbols. The hunger hasn't changed, it's only grown more elegant. Start with finance. Do you think endless debt is an accident? Debt is blood in another form. You labor, you sacrifice your time, your energy, your future, and the system drains it with interest. Debt feeds the machine exactly as corpses once fed the Carters. You give more than you receive, and what you give keeps something else alive, something bloated, invisible, untouchable. Then look at religion, not faith. Faith is pure, but the institutions that twist it. Golden chalices, marble cathedrals, preachers in silk robes. What are these but rituals of preservation? The wealthy sanctify their hunger by draping it in holiness. They drain not your veins but your devotion, convincing you that obedience is salvation, while their own appetites are masked in incense and scripture. And governance. Governance. Do you think laws are written for you? No. Laws are written as rituals of control. Every statute, every decree, is a binding spell disguised as civic order. You obey because disobedience carries punishment. But what is punishment but the extraction of fear? And what is fear but a kind of blood? The Carter brothers needed knives. Governments only need pens. These structures, finance, religion, governance, are temples. Temples to the same God the Carters served, the God of consumption, the preservation of the few, bought by the sacrifice of the many. And once you recognize the structure, the illusion shatters. You begin to see that the Carter brothers' story was never about two killers in the night. It was an allegory, a shadow play, a glimpse of the raw machinery that institutions later perfected. You must never forget this. The Carters were exposed because their rituals were sloppy. The elites who protected them learned from that mistake. They refined the practice until it became indistinguishable from normal life, until you stopped seeing it as horror and started seeing it as reality. The blood has not stopped flowing, it has simply been renamed. The villagers of Blackwood would later say that the silence in the hills after the boy's cries stopped was worse than the screaming itself. For a full day, no one approached the mine. Men who had spent their lives breaking stone with their bare hands would not step closer to that black hole in the earth. They gathered in the square instead, whispering about the soil that bled, about the hollow echoes that did not belong to any human throat. Women pulled their children indoors, shuttering the windows against the autumn wind, as though air itself might carry something unholy from that shaft. The priest attempted to bless the sight, but even he faltered. Each step he took toward the entrance left him pale, his voice cracking as he muttered the prayers. When he reached the edge of the mine, he claimed he heard words spoken in his dead mother's voice, calling him by his childhood name. He stumbled back, clutching the rosary so tightly it broke in his hand. The beads scattered on the dirt like black seeds. That night a council was held in the town hall. Lanterns flickered against rough-hewn walls as men argued whether to seal the mine forever or descend to recover the boy's body. Some swore it was their duty to retrieve him, to give him a Christian burial. Others insisted that no body remained, only something wearing his voice. One old man, who had been at the boy's birth, claimed that this was always meant to be, that the earth was reclaiming what had been wrongly given to it. His words silenced the room, for no one dared to ask what he meant. At midnight, the decision was made. No one would enter the mine again. They would fill it with stones and seal the opening with iron. But by dawn, when they returned with shovels and chains, the entrance was gone. The hillside looked whole, as if no mine had ever been dug. Only the boy's hat lay in the grass, damp with morning dew. From that day forward, the children of Blackwood were warned never to dig too deep, never to disturb what lay beneath their fields. For in the soil, they said, were voices that did not forgive and shadows that remembered. And so the boy who spoke only to corpses vanished from history, yet his story never truly ended. It became a blueprint, a warning, and a mirror. The soil that swallowed him, the shadows that whispered his name. They are not confined to Blackwood or New Orleans, to 1891 or any single century. They live in every system that hides the truth, in every institution that sacrifices the many for the immortality of the few. Look around you. The world is full of hidden chambers, of rituals disguised as bureaucracy, of sacrifices labeled progress. The machinery that once animated two brothers in a house outside London now thrives in boardrooms, laboratories, courts and parliaments. The hunger remains, refined, perfected, and invisible to those who choose distraction over clarity. The lesson is simple and terrible. Awareness is dangerous. Truth is dangerous, and the moment you begin to see the system for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You have become part of the descent, the witness, the participant, the one who knows. The boy spoke only to corpses, but you hear the living. And that is the real power and the real threat to those who thrive in silence. Remember what you have learned. Remember the patterns, the rituals, the protection that shields the powerful while exposing the expendable. Every headline, every policy, every social ritual carries the same mark of the old hunger. And every time you choose to look, to question, to speak, the system feels the tremor of awareness. The Carter brothers were not monsters. They were a lesson. The boy who spoke to corpses was not a curiosity. He was a key. And now, so are you. Because once the veil is lifted, there is no return. You cannot go back to ignorance. You cannot walk away from the labyrinth. And the shadows you once feared are no longer outside you. They are inside, waiting for your next choice. Awaken, observe, and never ever forget the world you see is only the mask. Behind it lies the machinery of eternity, and it has always been feeding,